Okay, so this is our video for Reading 33. And Reading 33 is entitled How Tracking Undermines Race Equity in Desegregated Schools. And it's written by Rosalind Mickelson. She is an academic with a background in sociology. The thing that I should probably preface this video by saying is this is a video that aligns with something that is of academic interest to me, which is education, educational inequities. So there is a little bit more sociological background material than what is normally provided in these videos. So please just keep that in mind as you prepare for this quiz. So we're actually going to start with some of that sociological background video. So if you look at US educational rankings, the US has consistently ranked behind other high income nations in terms of academic performance. And this goes back 40, 50 years. It's been a fairly consistent pattern. And part of that ranking is influenced by the fact that the academic performance of socially disadvantaged students is particularly low. And sociological findings related to educational equity seems to suggest that this is because families with higher incomes are better able to support education in terms of the resources and the assistance that they both provide within their homes, as well as their ability to pay for, like, resources that exist outside of the home, like tutoring or, going to like academic summer camps and other types of academic outside of school experiences. And then the other kind of factor is that schools in America oftentimes reflect the income of the neighborhood, because a lot of our county schools are set up around where you live. So low income neighborhoods tend to go to lower income schools, and these schools have fewer resources. And that has a lot to do with how we fund our schools in America. Fairly limited at the federal level. A lot of it comes from the state, but how states give out the funding can vary. And then some states also rely very heavily on local property taxes. And that's where the neighborhood effect really comes into play. And so to kind of understand this, these findings, sociologists, particularly if they are from the conflict perspective, meaning that they, see society as being in competition for limited resources, with the result being a stratification where people at the top of the ladder have better access to these resources and to better life outcomes than people at the bottom of the ladder. So we get a set of terms that come out of the conflict perspective of education: inequality of condition, inequality of opportunity, inequality of outcome. And I'm going to talk about all these in conjunction with one another, because they all relate. So the thing about America that we very much know about ourselves is that we have inequality of condition. Children are born into different families with differing amounts of resources. In a country that has a pretty substantial, wage and wealth gap, and people form families and have children all along that income wealth spectrum. That means that you get people that are born in public hospitals, to people that are reliant on free healthcare in the form of Medicaid, and they go home by bus with a car seat, which is a requirement to take your child home from the hospital, but with a car seat that they acquired through charity. And then of course you have your billionaires and such who, they are having their children in, private wings because they've rented out a whole suite in the hospital, and they go home to, by chauffeured car to, a house that is worth millions of dollars. So we call this inequality of condition. We know that everyone isn't born to the same level. And what we also know is that we have inequality of outcome. And that's just kind of true of all societies, even societies that are more socialist than ours. People where they end up as adults, how much education they have, what occupation they have, and its level of compensation and prestige and benefits. All of that varies, right? So, because once again, we have a society that has a pretty significant amount of wealth and income inequality. So we call that inequality of outcome. You start at different spaces and you end in different spaces. But for a country like America that prides itself on being a meritocracy, of being this type of society where mobility is possible, it's that third term that really is significant here, and that's inequality of opportunity versus equality of opportunity. How equal of an opportunity do we provide all children in the US so that they can ultimately land in positions that are a result of their own individual characteristics and habits and decision making, as opposed to them winding up in positions that largely reflect the condition that they were born into. If we have equality of opportunity, then it's almost like it's almost like a snow globe. We shake it up, and where you land isn't necessarily where you started. If we don't have a lot of equality and opportunity, then that mobility between where your parents started, where you started based on your parents' position, and where you wind up, there isn't a lot of shakeup. And so maybe unsurprisingly, even though we oftentimes talk about being the land of opportunity and where people wind up being on the basis of merit, it's worth noting that for a lot of people who have the conflict perspective, they kind of reject that viewpoint of America. And instead they say that, we don't have equality of opportunity. Our opportunity structures are pretty unequal. And because in this country, education is seen as being a pathway to mobility, that means that people that have this conflict perspective particularly focus on the role that education plays in the pathway to mobility. And so, the extent to which you agree with education being a pathway to upward mobility or not might be based on whether you embrace a more functionalist or conflict perspective on education. And like I said, that conflict position is that the system largely reproduces rather than reduces social stratification. And instead of expanding our pool of talent, for the most part, the discovery of talent will be limited because low income and minority children lack equal access to educational opportunities. And, this results in, not just lower achievements, but lower ambitions. And just to go ahead and throw in our third kind of primary perspective, which you might remember from your introductory sociology class, oftentimes, especially if you're focusing on lowered ambitions, this can be due to things like labeling and discrimination, which brings in that symbolic interactionist perspective. So certainly, one piece of evidence that conflict theorists oftentimes kind of cling to when offering evidence of their perspective of education is when we look at the relationship between students' test scores and their background. Oftentimes, students who have high test scores. And I'm sorry, and I forgot to add, and all of this chart is related to the likelihood that they attend and graduate from a four-year university within 6 years. So students that have high test scores that also come from privileged backgrounds have a very high chance of going and graduating from college. Students who have have a rich background and they have low test scores, and I'm talking about like lowest quartile, still over a quarter of them are able to get into college somewhere and graduate. To me, the more telling story is that students that come from poor backgrounds, the lowest quartile or quintile, and yet they still have those high test scores, which that in and of itself is quite an achievement, because test scores and students' backgrounds oftentimes have a pretty tight correlate. But even those students only have a 50% chance of then going and graduating from college, like a flip of the coin. And so in a lot of ways, academically, these should be strong students and they should be able to successfully get through college. The fact that they don't raises questions about, or it raises questions if you are a conflict theorist about, what does that really say about our educational system as a pathway of mobility? Now, turning to the reading. So Mickelson, begins with, a discussion about the significance of Brown v. Board versus education, which of course was passed in 1954. And it was about, racially desegregating schools. And the logic behind that decision that has continued to be kind of a focus of people interested in educational equity is, what role has school desegregation played in the efforts to provide equality of educational, opportunity? And so we talked about the importance of educational opportunity just a moment ago, and I'll talk about Brown v. Board of Education a little later in this presentation. But it's this idea, especially for racial minorities, and particularly back then, but even today, there is a higher probability due to both present day factors as well as historical factors that they are going to be lower SES. And so it was seen as very essential that schools be their pathway to mobility, schools being seen as that pathway to kind of the middle class American dream. And she focuses her study on CharlotteMecklenburg schools, which is part of why I chose this reading, because, I hope that it would resonate with you a little bit more to see your own city kind of reflected back at you in the pages, because for a very long period of time, prior to, as she notes, 2002, it was considered to be one of the nation's most successfully desegregated school systems. Now, I know for most of you, unless you are, a older returning student, that means that you went to school in the Charlotte Met system post federal order. And since that federal order about ending busing and desegregation efforts, it's worth noting that Charlotte has really struggled with both, their desegregation efforts, but also kind of their educational achievement as well. But, from the time Charlotte schools desegregated in 1971 to that federal order, it was held up as a good example of what desegregation could accomplish, and it was held up in comparison to other mid-sized cities, especially in the South. So there is a whole part of this article where she does talk about the legal battles surrounding, segregation and desegregation. And it requires some understanding of not just Brown v. Board, but after Brown v. Board, it's just worth noting because a lot of Southern school districts moved very slowly because in Brown v. Board, they said all due speed, and people interpreted all due speed as being not very speedy at all. But the other kind of Supreme Court case that has national relevance was the Swan versus Charlotte Meck case. And so, the thing about in Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, and this is 1971, is that this was the Supreme Court decision that basically said a school system could use mandatory busing as a way to desegregate its schools. Because the thing is because a lot of neighborhoods were segregated, you weren't going to desegregate schools effectively if you still allow people to go to their local schools. You ultimately still wound up with segregated schools. And so the Swan case basically said schools could bus people in order to achieve those desegregation aims. And just fun fact, you maybe are interested to know about me, but because I'm from Charlotte area, my parents are particularly, 1971 was their senior year of high school. So they were in that first cohort of students to experience busing. My mother stayed at West Charlotte, but my father was bused across the city to South Mecklenburg. So busing was how we achieved desegregation in this city. At least until that federal order, which they then discuss, what led up to that. So the federal order was in 2002. And at that point, there was no longer kind of a federal order to desegregate, to use busing to desegregate. And so the Charlotte Meck system kind of pulled back from doing that. So it's highly unlikely, unless if you're pretty young, that you experienced busing in Charlotte, unless of course you went to like some type of magnet or IB program. So this is all things that she discusses, like historical kind of factors in regards to equity issues within the Charlotte Meck system. But another thing that she kind of talks about is how there also can be issues related to desegregation or having truly integrated schools in regards to tracking. And so it says 248, but it's really that is not really the placement there. It's really should be 350, 351. But in regards to tracking, which is basically, you set up different tracks within the same school so that some people are on the college prep track, or they're, on the academically gifted track, and some people are tracked so that they are not necessarily taking college classes. This is how a school that is technically integrated still then winds up ultimately being segregated. And so in that sense, what tracking kind of claims to do versus what it says to do, what it actually does is worth considering, because tracking is supposed to improve outcomes, because the idea is that you're teaching people that have kind of a similar level of ability, a similar level of readiness in regards to certain subjects. And so this higher track versus lower track placement is supposed to help the students. But not only does it result in the tracks largely becoming racially imbalanced, with minorities being less likely to be in the higher track placement, but as she notes, that in terms of the actual findings about how successful is this at, helping students be better students or get better scores, and this is page 355, it doesn't necessarily seem that it is as successful as what tracking proponents claim that it is. And so all of this, of course, in terms of where her data is coming from CMS, is explained on page 351. She talks about the methodology that she uses. It's basically a 14-year-long case study. And so all of it is focused primarily on one particular high school, where she also gives survey questionnaires to high school seniors. And it began in 1997. So, she's been able to track the impact and the outcomes of a lot of different policies. And so she talks about, the lessons that she learned, in regards to different, first generation, segregation, as opposed to tracking, or what she calls second generation segregation, and the impacts of each. And so if you're looking specifically at her kind of takeaways, we'll get to those momentarily. The additional sociological background about racial segregation in education is where I'm going to focus and provide you a little bit more information before we focus a little bit more closely on Mickelson's findings. So America has had a long history of unequal education in regards to race, which probably isn't surprising. We can start by focusing on Native Americans who were sent to what was called Indian boarding schools. And basically the goal here was placing Native American children who, at this point, Native Americans have largely been rounded up and placed on reservations. They would take them from their parents and homes, and they would place them in these boarding schools that were run, largely by, whites. And the goal here was basically to anglicize them. They were forced to kind of give up their culture, everything from their clothing to their hair to their religious beliefs to their language. If they resisted, they were punished harshly. We now know that these boarding schools were the sites of all types of abuses. There was even, in the last 10 years, there was a huge case in Canada that showed, a good number of them were even killed. And they found their, they found like mass burial sites at these boarding schools. And these boarding schools existed for a very long time, well over 100 years. And it wasn't until the civil rights era that Native Americans began to regain some control over their education, their children's education. Instead, they started to focus on reservation schooling. So, having schools on the reservation. And it wasn't until 1966 that we saw the first Native American controlled school. The problem has been, not only though, do you now have like 150-year kind of historical precedent around past educational inequity issues, but there have been ongoing funding issues in regards to reservation schools. So a lot of the educational outcomes of the reservation school system are pretty poor. Now, for African American education, I don't know why I have this set up with that weird animation. So while American Indians, Native Americans were kind of being forced to conform to white society, African Americans were kind of being forcefully excluded from it. So there was a push to assimilate Native Americans in hopes that maybe they could be anglicized. But for African Americans, especially, under the slave system, they were very much treated like the other. It was prohibited for Blacks to read and write. And there were very severe consequences if you were Black and you learned to read or write, or if you were white and you were caught teaching someone who was African American how to read or write. So African Americans weren't really provided education in any large scale type of way until after slavery. During the Reconstruction period, this is where we saw the first schools for African Americans were opened. And it should be noted that a lot of these schools were first operated by white women from the North. But then one of the first things they did was they set up universities and training institutes. And this is where African American teachers largely got their start. And so these schools were later taken over by them. However, the Reconstruction era was super brief. It was only 10 years. And after that, public education for African Americans, while it wasn't explicitly prohibited, it was oftentimes limited in scope and poor in quality because the Southern states just didn't really give any funding for it. And post-Reconstruction, we enter into the time period in the South that we often refer to as the Jim Crow era. And so, Jim Crow goes from the early 1900s until the 1960s and 70s. And these laws basically legalize segregation across a variety of settings. And all of this relates back to an interpretation of the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision. So this was coming like right towards the end of the Reconstruction era, that said basically states had the right to provide separate but equal accommodations for African Americans. And so this, obviously maybe you've seen photos of the water fountains and the lunch counters, but this also extended to schools. Now it's worth noting, it's not that a lot of Northern schools were integrated, they weren't. At this time period, although it wasn't de jure by law, a lot of neighborhoods in the North were segregated by race. And so thus their schools were largely segregated as well because of that residential segregation. Now, during this time, there were some legal challenges to the status quo before we hit the civil rights movement, but it really was post-World War II where the civil rights movement really kind of got, gained some steam. And during this time period, the kind of big case, which is the case Mickelson's reading references, is the Brown versus Board of Education. And it's the case of Linda Brown in Topeka, Kansas. And ultimately, this case is significant because it ended legal segregation de jure. They basically said separate but equal was ruled a violation of the 14th Amendment, which protected the rights of American citizens. And certainly one of the more compelling pieces of evidence that was presented to the Supreme Court about how if it's separate, it can never really be equal were the Dahl studies, which I give you a link if you wanted to check those out. But it was basically this idea by saying that groups needed to remain separate, it was kind of predicated upon the logic that one group is inferior or superior to another, and that this has a negative impact on people, child in particulars, their own image and self-worth. So in 1955, the Supreme Court ruled that school desegregation must occur with all deliberate speed. And there was a huge backlash in the South. And part of this was because, part of it had to do with that interpretation, as I said, of what all deliberate speed means. So a lot of the Southern whites mounted a backlash against, desegregation. They stalled, they resisted, they closed their public schools and open private schools. And if you happen to not be able to afford the private school, but you were white, they would even give aid to poor white students so they could attend these schools, which have the term seg academies. And a lot of them were taught by their old teachers from the public schools. As time went on and the South continued to kind of resist and stall, admittedly, in some areas, the federal government got involved. Of course, one of the most kind of famous cases is the Little Rock Nine, who desegregated Little Rock Central High School, and they had to do so with an armed military escort in the first day, but also in even the first weeks. And this is a very famous photo of one of the women that was part of the Little Rock Nine, who accidentally showed up on the first day alone because she hadn't received the message that they were going to delay when their first day was going to be, because they were afraid of, these types of crowds. And it's worth noting that to varying degrees, these types of scenarios played out all over. Now, Charlotte and Charlotte Meck Schools, and I think this is a point that that Mickelson really identifies, it never kind of reached that level as what we saw in places like Arkansas and Mississippi. But part of it was because that even when they did away with the de jure segregation, because neighborhoods were segregated, the result was a lot of schools remained segregated. So what we started to see in some areas, including Charlotte, was the need for school busing, a court-ordered program that basically transports public school students to schools outside of their neighborhood. And like I said, this was meant to address de facto segregation. And so similar to before, there was backlash. Even people that did not oppose the end of de jure segregation, probably because they thought it wasn't going to impact them and their local schools because of de facto segregation, they now opposed busing, and there were protests. Once again, we were in the position where minority children had to be escorted by police, and desegregation, led to white flight to the suburbs. This is particularly true in the northern and the Midwestern cities. And then once again, a new round of the creation of seg academies. And even today, part of why we are interested in where do people go to school and how does that relate to racial diversity and school equity issues is because for a lot of states, property taxes, which vary by neighborhood or area, if they factor heavily into how your schools are weighted, this is how some schools wind up being better funded and having more resources than others. Now, oftentimes when I teach this in person, people often ask, were Hispanic and Asian children segregated as well? And the answer is yes, although not necessarily as consistently. It could vary state from state. It could even vary district from district. It's worth noting that two of the court cases that preceded Brown v. Board, but that definitely impacted the Supreme Court's decision-making related to Mexican Americans. One of those cases, one of the earliest of the cases, was a case out of Southwest California in Lemongrove in the 1930s. And basically in that case, the parents argued that Mexican immigrants in their communities were being segregated by school officials and having to attend subpar schools. And ultimately, while they found in favor of the Mexican families, part of why it didn't immediately lead to African Americans in particular no longer being segregated by school policy is because basically the judge was like, okay, being Mexican is an ethnicity, but not a race. So it's kind of like a funky loophole. But nevertheless, it was one of those cases that kind of set the tone for considering, doing away with de jure school policy laws based upon race and ethnicity. Now, just because that issue was addressed, it doesn't mean that there weren't other issues in regards to the Mexican American population in regards to schooling. So certainly because of the amount of time that I spent in California and teaching in California, around the same time you start to see in the South a pushback around school busing and having to use busing to segregate schools. In California, where it was less of an issue due to the larger numbers of Mexican and Mexican American students, the issue kind of became what was being taught in school, and were they being segregated into lower tracks? Were they receiving education, in their own language if English was their second language? And so this was a time period on the West Coast, while the South is having its kind of protests. You have what's called the Chicano Blowouts happening around LA. And so this was one of kind of our first, not just equity issues, not just addressing enrollment and attendance of minorities, but the type of curricula that's being offered to them. Around that same time, and once again, around that same state, we have the Lau versus Nichols Supreme Court case, and that resulted in changes to the San Francisco school system. And it's worth noting that this Supreme Court decision, which basically said they were basically segregating and isolating Chinese students, a lot of whom who did not speak English, and they were not attempting to provide them education in their own language. So they weren't really learning. And in that decision, the Supreme Court basically made a statement where they said that public education has to guarantee a meaningful education for all students. So for those of you who are interested in things like not just ESL programs in today's day, but even like disability accommodations, know that that comes out of that language in that decision from Lau versus Nichols. So now I'm coming back to the reading. Hopefully you don't mind that tangent. But basically, she presents her statistical kind of evidence in the latter part of the reading, and her argument about why segregation undermines educational equity, whether we're talking about what she terms second generation segregation, i.e. tracking, or first generation segregation, that de facto segregation that has occurred in Charlotte-Meck because of the move away from busing. But she talks about how, it results in reduced presence of qualified certified teachers at some schools, fewer AP course offerings, less access to current technology and media centers, older buildings, less opportunities for SAT preparation. And all of that just kind of chips away at the idea that education is a pathway to mobility for all students, regardless of their initial condition. And instead, it lends some credence to that conflict perspective about the role that education plays. So the reading concludes by basically saying that, here we are 70 years later, and we still really haven't adequately addressed the Brown mandate, according to Mickelson. but she pushes back against people that sometimes nostalgically say we should go back to segregated schools. She's very clear that she does not consider that to be the answer, and that by idealizing what segregation education looked like, i.e., being around students who looked like you, having teachers who cared, she said it ignores the brutal realities of the grossly inferior opportunities to learn, and not just to learn in that moment, but then what did that mean for those students in terms of their ability to successfully get into and go on to colleges. And so instead, what types of policies does she consider them people to consider? She obviously addresses policies related to both first generation segregation, but also second generation segregation, bringing back some busing, and creating programs in schools that are mixed ability, so that you don't wind up with segregation within the school. So, a question I want you to kind of consider, going back to those opening terms, do you believe we have equality or inequality of opportunity in education? How did the material in this reading on tracking and the background historical information influence your response? And do you have any ideas about how you can have a more equitable education outcomes in the future?